In this episode of the history of storytelling, we will dive into the tradition of fables or animal stories from 5 corners of the globe. These are Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. We will track their journey from ancient oral traditions to today's digital era, spotlighting timeless books, unforgettable characters, and the big ideas they carry. Fables have had a profound significance in human culture for millennia, rising beyond geographical boundaries and generations. They offer vital lessons, insights into human nature, and a rich tapestry of moral guidance. Their simple yet powerful messages still resonate, guiding us through life's twists and turns with wisdom and wit. In a world buzzing with noise and constant data inundation, fables remain beacons of clarity, reminding us to pause, reflect, and find the lessons hidden in the age-old tales. In contemporary society, animal stories continue to captivate audiences through various mediums, including literature, film, animation, and digital media. From classic fables retold in modern adaptations to original narratives exploring urgent social issues, animals remain potent symbols for communicating timeless truths and initiating meaningful conversations. And it is not just about morals. Animal stories also fire up our imagination and creativity, especially in children. With their colorful characters and magical worlds, these tales open up our minds to endless possibilities and teach us to think in new ways. In our fast-paced, high-tech world, animal stories still have a special place. They remind us that storytelling is timeless and has a way of connecting us all. So let us dive in and explore how these stories have shaped our past, how they're evolving with technology, and why we just can't get enough of them. A fable is a short fictional story featuring animals, plants, or inanimate objects endowed with human qualities and emotions that usually conclude with a moral. In the preface to his collection of fables, La Fontaine writes, "The fable proper is composed of 2 parts, of which one may be termed the body and the other the soul. The body is the subject matter of the fable and the soul is the moral." La Fontaine's definition is basic, and we should bear in mind that what the fable is becomes more sophisticated as we approach modern times. Let us say a few words about the use of animals as characters in tales told by humans throughout history. Why do we have this fascination with representing the human experience through animals? The selection of animals and other natural phenomena as characters in fables is not arbitrary. Rather, it serves 2 purposes: to create engaging narratives and to have an allegorical function in representing human behavior, societal norms, and moral questions. Animals are more than mere characters in our narratives. They function as symbols, archetypes, and mirrors reflecting human experience and behavior. By attributing human-like traits to animals, storytellers have ingeniously created allegories that resonate deeply with audiences, transcending cultural and linguistic barriers. Whether through the cunning fox, the wise owl, or the noble lion, these stories offer insights into human nature, morality, and the intricacies of social interactions. At the essence, animal stories serve as channels for conveying complex truths and timeless wisdom in an accessible and engaging manner. By personifying animals and imbuing them with human-like qualities, storytellers effectively create imaginative worlds where readers or listeners can easily relate to the characters and their experiences. The fable employs a generalized sense of time and place, which is not crucial to the story's meaning. It could take place anywhere and at any time, hence the universality when it comes to human behavior. What about the fable's subject matter and purpose? Let us compare and contrast the fable to the parable to explain this point. While the parable conveys a set of morals or beliefs that the listener needs to be reminded of, the fable is more critical and scrutinizes social circumstances. Fables tend towards detailed, sharply observed social realism, which eventually lead to satire. Parables are more instructive and clearer in their meaning and moral lesson, while fables can often be ambiguous. Another aspect of the fable is that it combines entertainment with moral teachings, ensuring that the story is both engaging and effective in teaching a moral lesson. Finally, it should be noted that there is a subgenre of animal stories called the pourquoi story or a story of origin. These are about how certain things in the animal kingdom or the natural world came to be. For example, the African fable entitled How the Leopard Got His Spots is such an example. Another example is the story entitled Why the Elephant Trunk is So Long. Animal stories possess a universality that transcends cultural and linguistic barriers. From Aesop's fables to the Indian Panchatantra tales, from African folk tales to Native American stories of origin, animals have served as protagonists in narratives across diverse cultures, each with its unique interpretations and moral teachings. This universality highlights the intrinsic connection between humans and the natural world, fostering empathy and understanding across different societies. Animal stories are a common form of storytelling in all cultures around the world, and they are quite an old and a resilient form. While their roots are steeped in oral storytelling traditions, their present-day forms have adapted to technology really well. We do enjoy them in the age of technology as much as our distant ancestors did, gathering in groups listening to stories. In this and the next episode, we will talk about fables from 5 corners of the world. These parts have contributed to and shaped the genre of animal stories through distinctive themes, characters, and books. Exploring the fable tradition from these regions is by no means exhaustive, but it gives the lover of animal stories a starting point and an idea to pursue this further. In Asia, the fable was always a part and parcel of the storytelling tradition. It served to entertain the listeners, but was also used as a means for imparting wisdom and for religious education in both Buddhism and Hinduism. In India, there are a few well-known collections of fables written in Sanskrit that influenced and shaped storytelling for centuries, first in India and then outside, both in the East and the West. The Indian tradition started as oral, and stories were transmitted from one generation to the next. With time, the Indian fable brought the form to a new level by introducing new techniques such as the frame story that connects many stories and presents them as one unit. From India, fables spread to the rest of Asia by way of Buddhist pilgrims, especially through the stories of the Jatakas, a collection of stories about Buddha's nativity and his many incarnations, some in non-human forms. Between the 4th and the 6th centuries, Chinese Buddhists adapted fables from Buddhist India in a work called Borjing. These were joined with traditional Chinese stories to enhance their understanding of Buddhist doctrines, initiating their own tradition of animal stories later on. In Europe, the fable has both a long history and a prolific one. It is formed through 2 traditions, the Aesopic tradition, the earliest of which goes back to the 6th century BCE, and this is the main source of influence. In ancient Greece and later in Rome, the short moralizing animal fables were a common form of storytelling. The Latin tradition was in turn the source of animal stories in the later national European languages. Beside the Aesopic tradition that mostly shaped the Western fable, there is the Asian tradition which traveled westward by way of translation and further enriched the genre and brought new elements to it, as we will see in detail in the segment about Europe. In the Middle East, there is an old tradition of animal stories, the earliest examples of which go back to ancient Babylon. Some of these appeared as early as 2300 BCE. However, a rich medieval tradition of fables was initiated through the translation of the Panchatantra from Sanskrit into Middle Persian and then from there into Arabic under the title of Kalila and Dimna, which initiated a tradition of fables whose influence reverberated throughout the Islamic world and led to important books, especially in the Sufi tradition, such as the works by Attar and Rumi. In Africa, a diverse presence of animals inspired a rich and a long tradition of fables that left its traces on world animal stories. The African tradition left us some memorable characters such as the trickster spider Anansi and the tortoise and the cunning hare. Anansi the spider, a trickster, now features in traditions beyond Africa, as the Africans that were taken to the Americas and the Caribbean as slaves carried these rich and meaningful people stories with them and gradually used them as a source of inspiration against the harsh reality of their conditions. These communities eventually developed their own distinct versions of animal stories. Among the Native Americans, the coyote is a common character and is often portrayed as a trickster figure. The stories involving coyote vary widely. The First Nations cultures have a deep connection with the natural world, and this is reflected in their fables. Animals, plants, and natural elements are not just characters but also integral parts of storytelling, emphasizing the interconnectedness of all living things. There are also origin stories, such as the story explaining how birds got their colorful feathers. In Navajo folklore, there is a fable about a boy who is able to communicate with the wind. In the Pacific, the shark is the character that stands out as the main character in animal stories. The fable is one of the most resilient forms of storytelling, and its adaptability to all ages and social and political circumstances made it one of the long-standing and ever-renewing and shape-shifting forms that humans across ages enjoyed and continue to do so today. Let us now turn to our first segment of this episode. The fable tradition in Asia is old. In India, there is one of the richest and oldest fable traditions that we have today. For hundreds of years, under banyan trees, both ordinary people and scholars gathered to listen to storytellers relate gripping narratives. There are a few collections of animal stories that endure time, traveled far and wide, and shaped storytelling as we know it today. In what follows, we will talk about three of these collections and their importance. These are the Jataka tales, the Panchatantra, and the Ocean of Rivers of Stories. What characterizes many of these Indian collections of stories is that they were part of an oral tradition that varied and shape-shifted with each region, generation, and storyteller. Over centuries, they grew and expanded. One of the oldest collections of fables is the Jataka tales, also known as Buddhist birth stories. These were composed between the 5th century BCE and the 3rd century CE. The 547 stories center around Buddha's journey from Bodhisattva to the enlightened person of the Buddha. As such, they are about repeated births and deaths of the Buddha on his journey. The framing device provides a narrative framework introducing the Buddha as he is having discussions with his disciples. This structure establishes a connection between the Buddha's present life and his previous existences in many forms, many of which as animals. Each story has a short present story where we see the Buddha surrounded by people asking him questions or mentioning odd events, followed by Buddha's reply. Buddha's answers take us to the second part of each tale, which is the past story. The second part makes up the bulk of each tale, and it takes us to the many births and transformations of Buddha, most of which are animals. In these past stories, the Buddha remembers his past self as a bodhisattva in a different form each time. The tales are organized around the concept of the 10 paramitas, which are virtues that a bodhisattva, an enlightened being, must cultivate to attain Buddhahood status. Each story focuses on one or more of these paramitas, such as generosity, morality, patience, and wisdom, and so on and so forth. This thematic organization helps convey moral lessons to the audience. The Jataka stories present a diverse range of narratives. The stories vary in tone, setting, and characters. Each story is both in verse and prose. It is believed that the verse part is the oldest, and they vary. Some are folk homilies, others comments from the Buddha. Yet others are eulogies or dramatized interchanges that provide a lyrical or emotional counterpoint to the main action. The Jataka stories are divided into 22 sections depending on the number of verses in each story. The Jatakas shaped storytelling beyond its place of origin and for a long time became the means of educating and teaching important lessons about life to their audience. The stories traveled to other lands, especially Buddhist Southeast Asia, where they were kept and told to an audience at festivals and special occasions such as the full moon. The Jataka tales have influenced drama, songs, dancing, and puppetry in these countries to the current day. Another important book of fables from India is the Ocean of the Rivers of Stories collected by Somadeva in the 11th century. Somadeva, believed to be a Kashmiri Brahmin, compiled these tales for the purpose of entertainment, education, and moral instruction. Before being compiled, these stories were in use in oral forms for centuries. In his epilogue to the collection, Somadeva states that he compiled the book for Suryavati, wife of the king of Kashmir. In the actual stories that make up the collection, we are given yet another account of the origin of these stories. In the first book of the collection, Parvati asks her beloved Shiva to tell her a story that she has never heard before. Responding to her request, Shiva relates the story of Vidyadharas, who are semi-divine sky dweller beings and holders of the knowledge that have magic powers. As Shiva tells the stories of the 7 Vidyadhara princes, one of his attendants called Malyavan overhears the stories and later on relates them to his wife, who happens to be the doorkeeper for Parvati. When she tells Parvati about the 7 stories, Parvati is enraged at the attendant Malyavan and curses him to be reborn on earth as Gunadiya, where he will live until he has told the tales that he overheard far and wide. Once he spreads the stories, his curse will be removed. On earth, Gunadiya writes the 7 tales he heard from Shiva on bark using his blood as ink in the Paishachi language. When the manuscript was presented to the Satavahana king, he burns the manuscripts on ground that it is written in blood and that it is written in a vulgar language such as the Paishachi. 6 out of the 7 stories are destroyed. One tale, that of Prince Naravanadatta, survives. The king, later on when listening to the story, decides to keep it and adds another tale, that of Katapita, to the adventures of Naravanadatta to make the whole of the collection. Somadeva weaves a complex tapestry of interconnected narratives that belong to various genres in this collection of stories. In this collection of stories, where one story seamlessly leads to another, the stories embedded within larger tales, not all of which are animal stories, contribute to the overall flow of the work, creating a captivating and intricate literary structure that inspired storytellers and ignited their imagination for centuries. This collection is unlike the other Indian animal stories in that these stories are not concerned with morality. It is a worldly book and it is about earthly life. Next and last collection on our list of the Indian animal stories is one that truly kept translators busy and gained great fame. Not many literary works traveled through time and geography and exerted influence as did the collection of animal stories known as the Panchatantra. First conceived in the 2nd century BCE, it later inspired storytellers and illustrators for millennia that followed. The Panchatantra, meaning 5 books or discourses, is a collection of interrelated animal stories. We are told that it was written by an 80-year-old scholar and wise man named Vishnu Sharma. The introductory chapter reveals that in the city of Mahilaropia lived and ruled a great king. He had 3 sons who were totally opposed to learning. Trying all solutions, the king fails to make his sons change their attitude. Then one of his ministers suggests that Vishnu Sharma educate the children. Inviting Vishnu Sharma, the king tells him about the failure he faced in educating his sons. The old scholar then comes up with an ingenious plan to embark on the education of the 3 sons and promises the king that in 6 months' time his sons will have changed and learned the art of government. To the amazement of the doubtful king and his ministers, Vishnu Sharma's plan is to teach the 3 sons through stories. That is because he believes through stories they will learn, feel and know what he teaches them. The collection is divided into 5 books, each dealing with a theme. Each book is dedicated to an idea and it opens with a frame story that proceeds to other sub-stories that skillfully blend narrative and dialogue with maxims, proverbs and precepts to illustrate the ideas of the book. The reader moves from story to story as in a labyrinth of narratives. Topics in the collection include the art of government, friendship, enmity, cooperation, loyalty, and betrayal. Stories have moral lessons to teach. These lessons are expressed generally in the words of Dharma and Niti. The first one means the moral law of the universe and the existence of order at every level, while the second means to live wisely and well. The first book is entitled The Estrangement of Friends, and it features the characters of the lion, the bull, and two jackals, Wari and Wily. This book is the longest of the 5 books, and it illustrates the events that often lead to the separation of friends. It begins with the forming of friendship between a king lion and a bull in a forest, and then the narrative moves to Wily and Wari. Most of the 32 interwoven stories in this book are told by the two jackals as they engage in the discussion of various issues, political, social, and moral in detail, illustrating each argument with a story from the animal world. Wily aspires to power and he has a plan. He wants to persuade the lion that his close friend the bull is a threat to his life. The lion eventually falls for Wily's argument and kills his best friend. As a result, the lion suffers greatly and his world is disturbed, but he cannot do much about it now. The second book is entitled Winning Friends. It features the dove, the crow, the mouse, the turtle, and the deer. This book presents examples of making friends through the friendship between a rat and a crow, later joined by a tortoise and a fawn. They work together to save each other, making sacrifices and risking their lives, in the process illustrating the essence of unity and friendship. This chapter is full of risky adventures in which these animals work together and manage to survive through their bravery and reasoning. Unlike the first book, in which the lion fell for the plots of the two jackals, animals in this group ward off dangers by listening to each other and understanding their own abilities. The third book is of crows and owls, and it is about war and peace. The frame story features the two clans of crows and owls and then proceeds to explain the various discussions through sub-stories from the lives of other animals. The two clans are traditional enemies. In this book, we see how the weaker crows are able to triumph over the seemingly stronger and more powerful owls by cunningly uncovering their secrets and vulnerabilities. The fourth book contains 13 fables and is entitled Loss of Gains, and it features a monkey and a crocodile. This book illustrates how achieved gains can be lost through a symbiotic relationship between a monkey and a crocodile. The book opens with the friendship between a crocodile and a monkey. As the crocodile spends more time with his friend, his wife gets jealous and comes with a plan to get rid of the monkey. She pretends to be ill and persuades her husband that the monkey's heart is the only medicine to cure her illness. The two then conspire to acquire the monkey's heart. The crocodile carries the monkey on his back and crosses water to the other side to secretly take his heart. When the monkey becomes suspicious, he cunningly says to the crocodile, "You know that we monkeys, when visiting our friends, we leave our hearts at home." Then he suggests that they go back and bring his heart from the tree where he had left it. When they go back, the monkey climbs the tree, and from its top, where he is out of reach, he makes fun of the crocodile. The crocodile underestimates the cunning monkey, who outsmarts the crocodile and saves his own life. The fifth and last book is called Rash Actions, and the frame story features the Baba who slaughtered the monks. One of the stories concerns a Brahmani and a mongoose. This book, like the one before it, works by negative examples, things we should avoid and look out for. The story goes like this. A Brahmani left her child with a mongoose while going to fetch water. As she left, a serpent came to the house and went towards the child's cradle. The mongoose, realizing this, tries to prevent the serpent from harming the child and goes into a battle with the serpent. Upon returning and seeing the mongoose covered in blood, the Brahmani mistakenly thinks that the mongoose killed her baby, not knowing that the mongoose sustains injuries while protecting the baby. The Brahmani later feels remorse for killing a friend, the one who saves her child. The book is multi-layered and animal characters enrich the stories and create an intriguing world. The dialogues are often comical as the animals try to outwit one another by trickery and deceit. While the Jatakas traveled east to the Buddhist countries and influenced animal stories, the Panchatantra traveled west to the Middle East and from there to Europe. These collections took with them themes, memorable characters, and storytelling techniques. For example, the literary technique of framed stories would influence generations of writers over a long period of time, from the Arabian Nights to the Decameron of Boccaccio and the Canterbury Tales of Geoffrey Chaucer to the 20th century short story cycles. Out of the wisdom literature that originated in the Sanskrit, the Panchatantra grew two significant branches from this trunk. First, the Arabic branch, beginning in the 8th century with the work of the scholar Ibn al-Mukaffa, who translated and compiled Kalila wa Dimna, and second, a collection often attributed to a legendary Indian sage known as Bidpay or Pilpay. The second branch was translated or adapted from the Arabic version and spread to Europe. Each of these branches grew in its own way, shape-shifting into other forms of artistic expression along the way. The fable as a genre is very old in the Middle East, and we have some examples preserved on clay tablets from Sumerians and Babylonians. The oldest examples belong to the Sumerian contest literature. These are dramatized debates between nature's rivals, such as imaginary creatures, animals, or inanimate objects. The contest goes as follows. The exchange of views occurs before a god who also serves as a judge. Some famous examples that we know of today are part of a collection of fables that were originally composed to honor the royalty of Ur between 2000 and 1900 BCE. Some examples from this collection are the Tamarisk and the Palm, the fable of the willow, the fable of the riding donkey, and the fable of the fox, which belongs to the folk stories found in many cultures today. The fable of the ox and the horse was composed later when horses were first tamed for human use. The fable opens with the horse and the ox on the lush meadows as follows. It made the pasture flourish for cattle and produce luxuriant growth. The ox and the horse became friends. Their bellies were sated with the luscious pasture. In their pleasure, they engaged in a dispute. In the ancient world, stories and tales traveled like silk, spices, and precious stones. They were carried from port to port by merchants, travelers, and sailors until they settled on another land and grew roots once again. In the new land, they always shifted shapes and took local color. As we saw in the previous segment, the Panchatantra is one such example. It is one of the most traveled books in history. Its first journey outside India started before 570 CE when it was translated into Middle Persian during the rule of Khosrow Anushirwan, Emperor of Iran. The story of obtaining a copy of the book and translating it into Middle Persian is in itself intriguing. This account is found in the Arabic translation of the book by the famous scholar Abdullah ibn al-Mukaffa in the year 750 CE. Ibn al-Mukaffa added 2 new chapters to the Arabic version that were not included in the original Indian book. The first of these 2 chapters details the story of how Burzaway traveled to India and obtained the book. It is said that Anushirwan ordered his court physician Burzaway to obtain a copy of the book which contained the country's knowledge enshrined in its famous tales. The book, however, was a secret and its contents forbidden to outsiders because the wisdom it contained was extremely valuable, a treasure to be guarded closely. Through assistance from an Indian friend, Burzaway manages to access the book and translate it into Middle Persian and bring it back to his king. In return for his efforts, the king offers his physician great wealth and money, but Burzaway refuses and asks instead for an extra chapter that relates his life and views to be added to the start of the translated book, making the second of the 2 added chapters. Here, Burzaway exposes his views about his life and times. Burzaway's religious views are striking. He says that he is unsure about religion as followers of religions stick to their views and ideologies and defend them regardless of logic and reasoning, and that this is the reason he chose to become a physician. Some critics see this chapter in the Arabic translation as an addition by Ibn al-Mukaffa himself, who wanted to pass a commentary on his times without directly stating so. He lived at a time of political turmoil where he saw that political power and authority were used for personal gains and often inflicted injustices on people for their opinions. Ibn al-Mukaffa treated the text freely, adding, as we just saw, new material into the stories and adapting them to the Islamic social, political, and economic conditions of the time. One other major addition to the Arabic text is that Ibn al-Mukaffa changed the frame story. Now, the Arabic translation starts with a king called Dabshalim who poses moral or political questions to a philosopher named Baydaba and requests him to relate a story explaining each topic he brings up. These questions mark the theme of the chapter. The first of the stories proper, that is after the two added chapters, is entitled The Lion and the Ox. This chapter opens with the frame story such as we saw in the Indian fable collections. Stories are multi-layered and one story leads to the next. We learn that the main characters of the first and the longest chapter, two jackals named Kalila and Dimna, live in the court of the Lion King, king of the country. Of the two jackals, Kalila lives in such a way that he is grateful and content with his social status, while Dimna aspires to power whatever the means to achieve it. For this reason, he decides to present himself to the king and his court as an advisor. Most of this book is in the form of dialogues between Kalila and Dimna. They try to justify their position through dialogues that link anecdotes involving both humans and other animals, in such a way that they give us precepts and morals about life in society, politics, and social relations in a playful and entertaining way. Dimna manages to persuade the Lion King that his best friend the ox poses danger to his life. The lion kills the ox but then regrets when he realizes how a good friend the ox was and how gullible he himself is. Then this is followed by the second part, which centers on the theme of mutual generosity, and it is entitled The Ring Dove. Thematically, this chapter is similar to the Panchatantra. The third part is composed of debates about warfare, espionage, and infiltration, and it is entitled The Crows and the Owls. It depicts the war between the crows and the owls. It has some witty exemplars such as the lady mouse and her choice of husbands. One day, as a man was sitting by the riverbank, a mouse falls down from the claws of a kite and lands near him. He wants to take the mouse and look after it, but he realizes that the mouse might be a burden on his family. So he prays to God that the mouse be transformed into a girl for his wife to look after. His prayers are answered and the mouse becomes a girl. When she grows up and wants a husband, she tells her father that she wants to marry the most powerful husband there is. She embarks on a mission to choose a husband from the natural world and engages in discussions with the natural elements, who eventually persuade her to marry a mouse whom they believe is the most powerful among them all for reasons that the story elaborates on. The fourth part is entitled The Turtle and the Monkey, and it is about a monkey who is able to save his own life from the tricks of a turtle who wants his heart to cure his wife from her illness. Finally, the last part of Kalila and Dimna is entitled The Holy Man and the Mongoose. These stories show how it is best that everyone mind their own business and not interfere in what they should not. The final fable in this chapter is about a raven that tries to learn to walk like a partridge, but in the attempt the raven fails to learn how to walk like a partridge and also forgets how to walk like he used to before. This is one of many comic and cautionary tales against overreaching. Kalila and Dimna is a very literary book. The language is slippery, provocative, and entertaining. It aims to make the reader think rather than teach fixed moral beliefs. Animal fables are woven with characters' debates as parables, exemplar, jokes, proverbs, and anecdotes throughout the collection. These fables influenced a long tradition of animal stories and storytelling in the Middle East. This influence was translated in two main ways: a change in storytelling as it led to the proliferation of prose stories at a time when literature was mainly in verse. These fables also enriched storytelling techniques. For example, the framing of stories and connecting them through an overarching tale became a narrative style. The second influence is the use of animals as characters in literature. One notable work that demonstrates this influence is Arabian Nights, or 1001 Nights as it is often called, which is a collection of Middle Eastern folk tales and stories that weaves animal stories into its mosaic of interconnected tales. The Arabian Nights features a variety of animal stories that add a delightful and sometimes moralistic element to the collection. These animal stories, like many others in Arabian Nights, serve as entertaining and instructive elements, often blending fantasy with lessons on human behavior, morality, and the consequences of one's actions. Animals play a significant and multi-layered role throughout these enchanting tales, contributing to the richness of the narrative and providing valuable insights into the cultural and moral landscape of the Arabian Nights. Animals often take on magical or supernatural roles. They may possess mystical powers or be transformed into humans, adding an element of fantasy and wonder to the tales. They are also cleverly employed as narrative devices. They may offer guidance, present challenges, or act as intermediaries in the unfolding stories. Their inclusion introduces unexpected twists and turns. Animals are also utilized for comedic effect and satire in Arabian Nights. Talking animals such as the witty parrot or the clever monkey add humor to the tales and contribute to the overall entertainment value of the stories. Finally, another notable work that was influenced by these animal stories is The Conference of the Birds, a 12th century Persian epic poem written by Attar of Nishabur. The narrative follows a group of birds on a mystical journey in search of the Simurgh, a mythical bird representing the divine. Each bird symbolizes a human characteristic or flaw, and the journey becomes a metaphor for the soul's quest for enlightenment and self-realization. The book delves into the themes of love, wisdom, and the challenges of spiritual awakening, using allegorical tales and rich symbolism to convey profound philosophical insights. Influenced by Attar, Sufi poets, especially Rumi, expressed their ideas through animal stories. The fable has long been a prolific and a common storytelling genre in Europe. As far as we know, the oldest tradition began in ancient Greece, and we have a collection of fables that is attributed to Aesop. From Greece, fables were then translated and adapted by Roman storytellers, from where the genre later spread to the national languages of the rest of Europe. Throughout European literary history, fables have provided a creative and an allegorical means of exploring human nature, ethics, and social norms, leaving a lasting influence on storytelling and moral philosophy. In the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, fables became popular with children, and with the new technology of recent decades, they have changed their shape and adapted well in various forms. Aesop's fables first circulated in the Mediterranean world starting in the 6th century BCE. There are a few accounts of Aesop's life, yet all that is available looks legendary and conflicting, but also intriguing. Some sources relate that he was a former slave and was brought from what is now the Balkans or possibly Turkey or Armenia. A Greek source dating back to the 1st century CE relates that Aesop was ugly and mute. Then one day he treated a priestess of the goddess Isis with great kindness, that he was given the gift of speaking and later storytelling. He was sold to a few slave owners, one of whom was a philosopher from the island of Samos, where he eventually earned his freedom. Yet other sources mention that Aesop traveled to Babylon and served as an advisor to the king, where he learned how to tell animal stories. Aesop had a tragic death. He was treacherously killed by the people of Delphi in Greece, after they accused him of stealing from the temple of Apollo. It is said that the people put a golden cup from the temple in his baggage without him knowing, and then reported him and arrested him for stealing. Ironically, Aesop pleaded for his life using some fables to dissuade his accusers, but the people of Delphi were adamant to kill him. They threw him from a cliff. Aesop's fables are very short, and in this sense they are different from the Eastern fables. He uses animal stories to critique the foolishness of humans and to illustrate specific moral points. Just like a joke ends with a punchline, the fable ends with a moral lesson expressed by one of the characters as the last words of the story. Structurally, the moral lesson at the end of the story usually corrects a previous judgment expressed earlier in the story. In general, fables provide either a positive or a negative exemplum. Positive one is behavior that is worthy of following. For example, in the fable of the fox and the lion in the cave is such an example. The story goes as follows. As the lion was growing feeble, animals were visiting him in the cave. However, the lion was eating all the animals that went inside the cave. One day, the fox decided to visit the lion. Upon arrival, he decided to stay outside the cave and talk to the lion from there. The lion asked the fox for the reason why he does not come inside the cave, and the fox replied, "Because I see the tracks of those going in, but none coming out." The moral lesson here then is that one should always be cautious and follow the example of the fox. A negative exemplum, on the other hand, is behavior or judgment one should avoid. Such an example is the story of the wolf. The story goes as follows. There was once a wolf who went wandering in the desert as the sun was sinking and about to set. Seeing his long shadow, the wolf exclaimed, "Should someone as great as myself be afraid of a lion? I am 100 feet tall. Clearly, I should be the king of all the animals in the world." As the wolf was boasting, a mighty lion seized him and devoured him. Realizing his mistake after the fact, the wolf exclaimed, "My self-conceit has been my undoing." Subsequent generations embraced Aesop and recast him according to the conditions and tastes of their times. Aesop's fables were orally transmitted and were first written by later Roman fabulists. Phaedrus in the 1st century CE was the first Latin author to translate the works of Aesop from Greek to Latin. He rendered the fables from Greek prose into Latin verse, thus elevating the fable into a literary genre at a time when verse was more respectable than prose. Phaedrus brought one more change to the genre of the fable. Until then, the fable was used for utilitarian purposes as a didactic anecdote used in sermons and as quotes during discussions. Phaedrus separated the fable from this use and turned it into an amusing literary genre to be read on its own. He composed 5 books of fables in verse. At first he translated Aesop, but in his later works he added to Aesop's work, modifying their meaning and settings. His books were 1st century bestsellers. Further adaptations of Aesop's fables in antiquity were by the poet Babrios in the 2nd century CE. He composed fables in Roman verse. These 2 Roman versions of Aesop's fables deviate from the Mediterranean influence but maintain some key features. The wit and didactic use suited to educating the audience who studied fables as examples of their own writing and ethics. These new adaptations did one more addition to the moral aspect of the fables by writing them in verse. In Aesop's fables, the moral of the story was pronounced by one of the characters in the form of a lesson to be learned. In these new adaptations, the new authors separated the moral of the fable and kept it in the form of what critics say either a promethium, a moral at the start of the story, or an epimethium, a moral at the end of the story. They thus emphasize the voice of the author and impose it on the story. Comparing the fables of Phaedrus and Babrios, one notes that Babrios tended to de-emphasize the moral lesson and his fables are characterized by the abundance of dialogue. After 10 centuries of success as part of Greek and then the Roman culture, the fable fell into obscurity for a time, only to be revived in the 10th century. In medieval Europe, at the time when religion was the dominant force in the lives of people and the source of morality, the interest in the fable was revived again as a form of instruction and teaching. One of the prominent fabulists of the period was the 12th century Norman French writer Marie de France. This new interest in the fable continued writing fables in verse started by Phaedrus and Babrios in Latin. A writer of courtly romance and fairy tales, Marie de France wrote an anthology of 102 fables upon which her fame resides. She was influenced by the Aesopic tradition through the translated works of Phaedrus and the Latin book of fables known as Romulus. Some of her fables show an Eastern influence from translations of the Panchatantra. Marie is distinguished for her more liberal subject matter, giving voice to female characters in her stories. One of her female characters, the mouse, is often depicted as having a strong personality. In her fables, female characters tend to be tricksters and powerful. Other themes in her work are typical medieval motifs of the poor versus the rich and the powerful versus the powerless. Marie de France's revival of the fable initiated a tradition of beast stories or beast epics. These are longer animal tales composed of episodes in which 2 animals confront each other. An important example of this beast story is Reynard the Fox. These tales are allegorical narratives that satirize and critique medieval society in an entertaining and accessible way. Reynard is known for his wit, clever schemes, and ability to outsmart other animals, particularly the wolf, the bear, and the noble lion. The stories often involve Reynard using his cunning to escape punishment for his misdeeds. Reynard's origins can be traced back to medieval European literature, particularly to Old French and Middle Dutch works from where it later spread to other European literary traditions. The character is believed to have originated in France in the 12th century. It gained popularity in the 13th century with the French epic poem The Romance of Reynard. The stories, composed in verse, depict Reynard as a cunning trickster who outwits his enemies, often represented by other animals. These tales served as satirical allegories, critiquing various aspects of medieval society, including the clergy and nobility. Dutch writers adapted and expanded the tales, in which Reynard often faces other animals like Bruin the bear and Tiber the cat. The Dutch tradition added new elements to the stories, contributing to the evolution of the character in animal stories in Europe. Reynard's popularity continued to grow in the 16th century with German and English adaptations. At this point in the history of the genre, there was a major development in characterization. In Aesop's fables, characters were generic representatives of their species, not specific individuals. It is with Reynard tales that this change to characterization happens. With the later character of Reynard, characters in fables now have personalities of their own, separate from their own species. Here, as in the medieval beast epics, the narrative becomes more elaborate and characters have their own personality. They have memory, personal names, and motivation. An important aspect of the fable in Europe, initiated by Tales of Reynard, was the pervading use of animal stories for satire. The authors of these stories used them to attack feudal institutions, as the animal disguises gave the satirists immunity from authorities. Writers such as Geoffrey Chaucer, Jonathan Swift, Kirillov, and later George Orwell and Thurber continued this tradition of satiric animal stories. In the 17th century, the fable flourished once again in Europe. This time it was on the hands of the French fabulist La Fontaine who popularized the form. La Fontaine did not invent the basic material of his fables. This he drew from two main sources: the Aesopic and the Latin tradition of Phaedrus on the one hand, and then on the other hand the Eastern tradition through translations of fables from the Persian, Indian, and Arabic collections. La Fontaine's first 6 books, known as the First Collection, were published in 1668 and were followed by 5 more books known as the Second Collection in 1678-79 and a 12th book in 1694. The First Collection follows the Aesopic style. Stories in the Second Collection show even greater technical skill than those in the first and are longer, more personal, and more philosophical. Many fables in the Second Collection are influenced by the Eastern tradition. As we mentioned earlier, the Indian fables that were translated into Arabic were in turn translated into European languages as the Fables of Bit Pay. This is how this collection of fables traveled westward. From Arabic, it was translated into Hebrew and then into Latin. From Latin, it was translated into other European languages such as Spanish, then into Italian, from which North's English version came. Between the 11th and the 18th centuries, there was a copy of this book in almost all European languages. The main theme in La Fontaine's fables remained that of the traditional fable, the fundamental, everyday moral experience of mankind throughout ages, voiced through a wealth of typical characters, emotions, attitudes, and situations. Written in verse, his fables satirize the court and its bureaucrats, the church and the rising bourgeoisie. La Fontaine's fables represent a zenith in the genre, blending social commentary, moral instruction, and poetic artistry. His work has left an indelible mark on the tradition of fable, influencing subsequent generations of writers and contributing to the enduring popularity of the genre. From the end of the 18th century and through much of the 19th century, a subgenre of animal stories known as animal autobiography emerged. This trend was mainly concerned with domestic animals such as dogs, cats, and horses. It is believed that the genre started with Dorothy Kilner's The Life and Perambulations of a Mouse, 1783. A successful example was Anna Sewell's Black Beauty, 1877, which is written from the perspective of a horse as a first-person autobiography. The host describes growing up on an English farm, then the hardship and difficulties he faces pulling cabs in London, and finally his later retirement in the countryside. The subgenre was so successful that it continued into the 20th century. Animal stories in the 18th and 19th century provided a space in which vicarious identification with the animal experience was made possible. However, it should be noted that these authors, while calling for kindness towards animals, were not calling for animal rights. Darwinism influenced the tradition of animal stories towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century in two ways. In the first, writers parodied Darwin and his ideas about evolution using animal stories. The second led to a new subgenre of animal stories that found in the Darwinian science and inspiration for a new realistic type of animal stories that reacted against the sentimentalism of the earlier experiments. This subgenre was pioneered by Jack London and Ernest Thompson Seton. The animals are still anthropomorphized, but there is a better understanding of animal life and behavior. For example, in Jack London's The Call of the Wild 1903 and White Fang 1905, there is a brutality that characterizes the animals' lives that sets these types of stories apart from the pathos of the earlier writers. In the 20th century, animal stories developed explicit ecological concerns. One early example was Beatrix Potter, who wrote and illustrated charming animal tales. Potter's stories are set in the English countryside, capturing picturesque landscapes, idyllic gardens, and homes evoking a sense of nostalgia. Beatrix's relationship with the natural world was beyond theoretical depiction. Later in her life, Beatrix Potter became a dedicated conservationist. She used the profits from her books to purchase and preserve large areas of land in the Lake District, contributing to the conservation of the natural environment. The ecological aspect of the fable will be explored later on in this episode when we talk about children's cartoons, video games, and documentaries dedicated to animals and the environment. While fables are currently most commonly associated with children, this was not the case for the majority of the genre's history. Until the 18th century, fables were primarily written for an adult audience. Subsequently, there was a shift in the intended audience. One of the first writers of fables for children was Sarah Trimmer. Concerned with the educational and moral development of children, she saw a lack of proper moral teaching in fairy tales and instead saw animal stories as a medium for teaching children. In her work, The Story of Robins, 1786, she tells two parallel stories. One is the story of the Bensons, where we see the mother teaching her son Frederick how to treat other species. The other story in the book is about a family of talking robins. However, it is late in the 19th and 20th century that the use of fables for children occurred on a large scale. Some of the most famous talking animal characters were created by writers such as Rudyard Kipling, Beatrix Potter, A. Milne, and others. The Tale of Peter Rabbit is perhaps Beatrix Potter's most famous work. Published in 1902, it tells the story of a mischievous rabbit named Peter who disobeys his mother's warnings and ventures into Magrico's garden, leading to various adventures and accidents. Rudyard Kipling sets his famous work The Jungle Book in the Indian jungle. This collection of stories features anthropomorphic animals such as Mowgli the man cub, Bagheera the panther, and Baloo the bear. Mowgli, being a human raised by wolves, grapples with his identity and place in the jungle. The stories explore the consequences of human actions on the environment and the delicate balance between man and nature. The Wind in the Willows by Graham Kenneth features anthropomorphized animals like the mole, the rat, the badger, and the toad. The novel explores themes of friendship, adventure, and the changing rural landscape. Winnie the Pooh by A. Milne centers around the honey-loving bear Winnie, who lives in a wood with his animal friends. Known for his gentle and kind-hearted nature, Winnie the Pooh often finds himself in simple, charming adventures that highlight friendship and curiosity. The 21st century showcased a diverse range of animal stories spanning literature, animation, film, documentaries, and video games. Animal stories continue to resonate with audiences, offering timeless lessons and entertaining narratives. In the 21st century, both themes and mediums add to the form and make use of its dynamism. In the century, animal stories have been used to discuss the myriad issues faced by humans all over the world, from the emerging issues of environmental problems to artificial intelligence to the traditional problems of the economic, social, and political nature. In our century, there is more awareness of environmental issues than ever before. Storytelling is often used to convey messages about the impact of human actions on the planet. Stories may focus on endangered species, habitat destruction, and deforestation, using animal characters as symbols for broader ecological concerns. These tales often feature animals as protagonists who work together to overcome challenges related to the human impact on the environment. In contemporary animal fables, the relationship between humans and animals may be explored in new ways. Some stories focus on animal rights, showcasing the intelligence and emotions of animals, while others highlight the benefits of positive interactions between humans and the animal kingdom. While not fictional stories, documentaries about animals are now a common form of narrative that showcase the real struggles and behaviors of animals in their natural habitats or in captivity. These documentaries often convey powerful messages about conservation and the impact of human activities on wildlife. Animal fables in the 21st century often reflect many of the social problems of our world, such as the importance of diversity and inclusion. Animals from different backgrounds or species learn to coexist and appreciate each other's differences, promoting messages of tolerance, acceptance, and unity. Animation studios often use animal characters to tell compelling stories. Exploring philosophical issues that emerge with artificial intelligence is another topic that animal stories often deal with. These stories examine the merging of biological and artificial intelligence, raising questions about identity, autonomy, and the ethical treatment of sentient beings. Video games and other interactive media continue to redefine the way we tell stories in the 21st century and offer new ways of experiencing them. What is unique about most video games is that while they incorporate animal characters into their narratives, they offer players a chance to experience stories from unique perspectives. These games are interactive. The player is immersed in this world and actively constructs and tells part of the story. In this episode, we have covered the tradition of the fable from Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. As we have seen, animal stories often provide a safe space for exploring complex societal issues and ethical dilemmas. By framing human concerns within the context of the animal kingdom, storytellers can address sensitive topics such as injustice, prejudice, and environmental conservation with subtlety and nuance. Through these narratives, readers are encouraged to reflect on their own behaviors and values, encouraging personal development and self-reflection. The appeal of the form lies in its capacity to both entertain and educate. Additionally, the genre is notable for its adaptability. The tradition has not only endured until the present day, but has also evolved to address contemporary themes and issues that are pertinent to the 21st century. These narratives continue to serve as a potent vehicle for conveying ethical principles, investigating the nuances of human nature, and fostering a sense of compassion for the natural world. They also facilitate discourse on emerging issues such as the relationship between humans and technology. Finally, the fable tradition has contributed to the development of storytelling on a global scale and continues to do so. It has contributed to the development of storytelling in both content and form. As demonstrated in this episode, themes and characters were transported from one location to another and assumed new forms. With regard to the form, the tradition introduced a number of storytelling techniques, including the frame narrative, which presents a collection of stories as an interlinked unit of stories. If you like the content of this episode, please like and press the subscribe button.